Welcome to Gov2 on Fused Logic TV. I'm your host, Michael Kryton, filling in for Walter Schwabe. I will be joined today by Alexander Howard, Washington Correspondent of O'Reilly Media, and John Moore, the founder and CEO of Government in the Lab. But right away, we will go to Kananaskis, where Walter Schwabe is Skyping in. Walter, tell us what you're doing down there.
Well, literally, guys, thank you, Michael. Literally, I'm sitting in a room, essentially on stage with about 30 people in the room right now who are watching this show live here at the Delta Lodge in Kananaskis. I am attending and presenting at the Society of Local Government Managers of Alberta. We are filled the room with administrators from towns across Alberta. We've had a morning session and an afternoon session. We've learned a whole lot about what municipalities are going through at multiple levels of administration and the things that they have to go through, and how we integrate social technologies, how we talk about and think about open government frameworks, and it's been a very exciting day thus far.
Excellent. What are the prevailing themes? What are the kinds of things people are focusing on that are at the top of the list?
It's actually a great question. One of the primary questions that came out of this morning's session was, okay, we've got some of these social technologies deployed, but how do we start using them more effectively to engage our residents? And then what do we do if we don't have the capacity to deal with that?
And what are some of the suggestions that are coming out? What are people leaning towards in terms of the developing process of communicating between public and government?
Well, one of the key things is around time management. Certainly, teams this morning, folks learned how they could be more efficient in their job tasks because people are feeling overwhelmed. They have too many things on the go, and so they need to find ways to be more efficient. Certainly, the use of different technologies than what they're using now can really help out with that. We went through that this morning. We're going to do that this afternoon as well. In fact, this very show is a demonstration of how smaller communities can do great things in terms of broadcasting messages unedited by traditional media.
Well, it's interesting that you're there and talking about what you're talking about. I'll be speaking with Alex about this. New York City has just announced its new roadmap to be the nation's premier digital city, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And speaking of that, maybe throw it open to John Moore and Alex Howard. Would you like to ask Walter a particular question, given where he is right now?
John?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, Walter, what's the biggest learning curve that you think people have in terms of getting started with this new way of doing business?
Well, one of the key things that came up this morning was that council, mayors, reeves are tending to be a barrier. We have to educate them about what's possible before they can get any sort of power to move forward on this. There are a lot of people within the organization that do want to move forward, but they basically answer to folks who are not invested in this space at all. So that's one of the barriers that we were discussing for sure.
It's interesting that you mention it because John Moore, we'll be talking with him on one of the stories that he's covering. And in Bologna, Bologna, Italy, I should say, they're obviously beginning to look more seriously at the kinds of things that you guys are looking at in Kananaskis. John, you have any comments around that?
Well, I was going to say one of the most common complaints, or one of the most common challenges that I'm seeing is tying what's getting people excited around social media or open data and all the other stuff that we're talking about, tying those to real goals at the upper levels so people can say and understand why it's important. Because I think what I see a lot is what Walter pointed out. They're not necessarily excited at the top because they're thinking about the details of interacting on Twitter or Facebook, and they're not seeing how it actually helps them solve a goal.
So, Walter, what's on the agenda for this afternoon, and sort of where is the roadmap of what you're doing leading to in terms of the sessions you're having?
Well, I think I'm going to sign off right away because I'm going to get back on the roadmap and get back with the program here. The folks this morning would have, I think, enjoyed seeing a little bit of this, but the way the timing worked out, the afternoon group got to see it instead. But we're going to get back talking about giving a foundation of social technologies, how they can be deployed effectively for a community, talking a little bit more about open government, what things they should be considering there, and then we're going to move into actually using the stuff, building a bit of an action plan and actually using some of these technologies, much like we're doing right now, That's what we're going to finish off the day with. This morning's group was terrific, and this afternoon's group looks even rowdier than this morning, so we're going to have a lot of fun. And I'm going to sign off with you guys. Have a great show. We'll talk to you next week.
Thank you, Walter. That's Walter Schwabe, live from Kananaskis, where he's doing some sessions on the topic that we're engaged in right now. And let's jump right into it. Alex, New York made the big announcement. It wants to be the leading nation's premier digital city. But there's a couple of things you point out in your article that are under the radar. What's significant about what New York is trying to do? But is there something we're not seeing? Is there an underbelly to this that might be important to note?
Well, this is New York City. There's always an underbelly somewhere. The social media side of this is going to always, I think, dominate some of the tech headlines. And that's not a surprise. It's not even necessarily a bad thing. Certainly when you see the mayor of New York City, Mike Bloomberg up there, talking about Foursquare, talking about Twitter, Facebook, et cetera, and looking at the ways that New Yorkers are using those things, it makes sense that they want to go find New Yorkers where they're living online, so to speak. But the reality of this stuff is that it's the structural change that is likely to stick around from administration to administration. And then you start looking at the policies around the use of different kinds of software, around acquisition and procurement, in bringing in open source technology, for instance, or about the way the city is trying to release data. And that's where things get pretty interesting. I think that the way that the city is thinking here is what may be the most important thing, that they're trying to involve more of the citizens and businesses and all the different stakeholders in the city in governance itself. It's much harder to do, but clearly they're taking some steps to open things up.
What I find interesting is it's really a leadership statement to become the nation's premier digital city. So I wonder, are other cities going to sort of sit back and wait a little bit to see what New York does, or is it really, are we in the middle of a free-for-all where everyone's trying to do what they can to improve their platforms?
There's a lot going on with that statement, so let's unpack it. I mean, first there's marketing. Right. I mean, that they're pretty clear that they want to be competitive as a place for entrepreneurs to come and start businesses. Start businesses, you get tax revenues. You also have the cachet of having a startup there. You want to be friendly in that sense, be known as a place where there's a combination of talent, education, high quality of life, et cetera. And so what we're increasingly seeing as more cities become more wired, that entrepreneurs have more choices to go to some place that's not Silicon Valley. Traditionally, there used to be a lot of tech companies outside of Boston. Now you've got New York in the mix, and there's other cities making pitches too. Certainly San Francisco, very famously, has some startups there. Portland, Oregon is now in the mix. Seattle, a little company, Redmond, and another one across the way is selling a couple books and other things online. There'd be Amazon. They're all trying to attract businesses. There's something else, though, that's really important in terms of thinking about being a quote-unquote digital city, and that's how well the city itself is serving the citizens and businesses who live there, and how it's using technology, and that goes to the Smarter Cities Initiative, et cetera. And there's some really great competition around some of the open government or open data initiatives that we've seen come out of this. Really immediately on the same day that New York opened up, there was some really collegial joshing between John Tolva, who's the new CTO of Chicago under newly inaugurated Rahm Emanuel, saying, chuckling away at saying this announcement came in the same time that we came in, and they have a pretty bold, in some ways, open government plan that's buried in the mayor's transition plan. So I think you'll see some friendly competition in the open government front, which is good for citizens, and then you'll also see a lot of jostling in terms of trying to attract the next big thing to come and put its headquarters there.
All right, John Moore, let's jump across the pond, the lake, and a piece of the desert over to the United Arab Emirates. They're upgrading their e-participation and revamped federal portal. What does that story mean?
Well, one of the things I want to point out, because it speaks so truly to all of this that we're trying to accomplish, that Alex pointed out, is a lot of the changes that are really important are the ones that are going to go from administration to administration that have a long-term bang for the buck. And that's where the United Arab Emirates are really focused too. They've put a lot of focus into their into their technology front in terms of citizen participation. And what they've recently done is revamp their portal, their website, to really make it a place that citizens can come in and ask questions, can find services online and offline, and really trying to focus on making it about engagement with citizens. And one of the things that always amazes me that it's easy to lose sight about is open government to me is not so much about democracy. It's not about a particular political system, but it's about the fact of trying to do more for the citizens within the confines of that government structure. And the UAE, they've really done a nice job there. So that's it. That's a lot of the changes that are taking place there.
Now, do you think what's happening with New York? I mean, obviously a lot of money over in that side of the world. And I mean, ultimately, New York has resources, but they've also got a large region to take care of. But do you think the UAE is going to be watching closely as to what New York does, or will everybody just basically be doing their own thing as far as it goes?
I don't think the UAE really cares a whole lot about what New York is doing, other than trying to learn from each other. There are definitely people that I talk to in the Middle East, in Dubai, in the UAE, that do pay attention to it in terms of wanting to understand, the techniques and the strategies being employed. But they're not really looking at it so much as a competition, as a learning opportunity. In a lot of places in the Middle East, like UAE, Bahrain, they don't have to worry about some of the same issues that we have to worry about here in terms of justifying the money to spend on these projects to the same level that we do. If they define it as a priority, they put the money toward it. So in Bahrain, for example, right nearby to the UAE, they basically made a push to become one of the top countries in terms of e-government, in terms of delivering services to their citizens through electronic means. And they invested heavily over the course of 10 years. And they shifted up, I think it was 30 spaces in terms of the UN. The UN measures all of this. And they moved up to number 17 from number 50. They can invest where they feel there is need. So in a way, I don't think they see it as a competition as much as if it's important to them, they're going to invest in it.
Thank you, John. You're watching Gov2 on Fuse Logic TV. My guest, John Moore, founder and CEO of Government in the Lab. Alexander Howard, Washington Correspondent O'Reilly Media. Alexander, I really like this particular story, parsing a new report, 3 ways the internet is shaping healthcare. And I think given the rising costs of healthcare in the U.S. and certainly with what people are thinking in Canada, healthcare and the internet are definitely an opportunity to help people become more proactive in terms of their health. And I find it interesting in your article, a couple of things you say. 1/4 of online users have looked at drug reviews online, with some 38% of caregivers doing so. 1/4 of online users have watched a video about health. Tell me about the 3 ways the internet is shaping healthcare.
Sure. I just want to go back to something that John mentioned, and I'll hit right back on this.
Sure.
I think what he's talking about with open government might be shifted to the open innovation approach, which is to say trying to think about using technology to deliver services better. The traditional understanding of open government in terms of a more transparent or accountable government, which is how people have been using it for decades, is not something people generally would apply to the Middle East. So this is something where he differs a little bit in terms of how to define this movement. Certainly with what's happening in Bahrain, we're talking about a government that's actually shooting its citizens right now. So I think that it's great to talk about what they're doing with e-government, but in terms of open government and actually involving citizens in governance, when we're describing regimes that are absolute monarchies, it's important to separate out what they're doing with digital technology to improve the way that they can deliver some services from the way that it actually enables citizens to hold the government either accountable or to make any kinds of changes on their own. Remember, the UAE does not have an electoral tradition, and that the kinds of participation or collaboration that New York is certainly approaching in terms of inviting citizens or businesses into the governance practices would probably land somebody in prison in many of these countries. And certainly with Bahrain, we just heard the president speak about Bahrain, what's happening there. I think it's very important to recognize that what's open there, maybe some of the ways they're thinking about using technology for services, but not for some of the other transparency aspects of the agenda. That said, I just wanted to get that out there.
Well, just thinking, just in case, different perspective, John, any quick response to Alex's comment?
Well, I think Alex and I disagree a little bit on this, but that's okay. That's how we move this conversation forward. There is a different level of citizen participation in each of these countries than what we have here. However, there's still citizen participation within a defined context. To me, that's open government, that's citizen participation. You could argue the same kinds of things here in a sense, but I don't want to get into a philosophical debate about this and spend the whole show on it. But we disagree. There is citizen participation around certain projects, around certain agenda, but there's it's a lot different, and I agree with Alex completely, than what you're going to see in a democracy like in the United States.
Excellent. Let's move on to healthcare. The 3 ways internet is shaping healthcare. I think, like as I mentioned before, that given the costs of healthcare and the waiting times, certainly in Canada, it's one of the big issues. Being more proactive about one's health is almost becoming a matter of necessity. So, tell us about the 3 ways the internet is shaping healthcare.
Sure. Well, the first thing is the way it's shaping everything else, right? We're more connected to one another than we really ever have been, and we're more mobile than we ever have been. And that's changing the way that we search for information, the way we can access information, and the way that we can talk to one another about our experiences. So there's something that's very happy from that, in the sense that with everything that's out there, you can access a wealth of pharmaceutical information, which people are doing. You can access information about treatments, and you can do what you can within certain boundaries to aggregate information about yourself. And that's actually one of the first big trends. Is we're seeing something called the quantified self. If you Google that, you'll see there's a book about it. There's been a lot written about it. And one of the big surprises from the study is actually that 1/4 of online users are tracking their own health data. That's very interesting. And from the perspective of where technology is moving, it's a very important trend, which is to say, instead of having a government or a hospital or a clinic or some other third party, you're taking an active role in tracking and holding on to your own health data. Now, there's going to be some real challenges around that. People can and will lose that data. They won't secure it very well. There's going to be all sorts of very difficult privacy and security issues that come out of this. We're seeing some of them happen when these institutions get audited by security professionals, and they see the holes in this. People's security on their own behalf is even worse, really, if you think about how much information we carry around in our smartphones or laptops now when they get lost. But it's a very important trend, and it has a really interesting relationship to how we own our own health. When you measure something, you start to have a different relationship with it. So when you start to measure how much you're eating, how much you're exercising, how much you weigh, statistically, interestingly, it shows that you tend to do a bit better in terms of your own health. Second big trend.
Yep, go ahead. Sorry, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Second big trend is this idea of participatory medicine, which relates to what I was talking about, right? This idea that now you have e-patients and peer-to-peer healthcare, where people are actually sharing what's happening to them on sites like Patients Like Me. They're using social networking to share their experiences. They're going there for support. They're going there for ways to connect with other people. Caretakers are going there to try to share information with one another. What's interesting, though, is that they're going to those networks for support and for community. They're not necessarily going there to get data. So there's a very important relationship happening between the release of open data from the CDC or from the National Library of Medicine or from Health and Human Services, because then that data becomes the foundation for people to self-educate better. And then that relates to the third trend we're here, which is really mobile, right? I mean, the internet is arguably less of an impact in people's lives than having a cell phone is right now, right? There's a huge digital divide in terms of access to internet versus not. I think Pew just came out with new numbers today that I think 77% of people in the U.S. are connected to the net. That still leaves nearly a quarter of the nation unconnected. Globally, those penetration rates are much lower. But on the other hand, there are billions and billions of cell phones. So we can easily extrapolate from that mobile is going to be incredibly important in terms of giving people access to information where and when they are, when they need it. And the challenge here is that the difference between having somebody equipped with a smartphone that has data behind it, that has apps, and somebody who just has a feature phone, so to speak, a flip phone, et cetera, is significant. So we're starting to see a real data divide, right? A digital divide that's really predicated upon your access to data because you have a data plan and a smartphone versus someone who doesn't, right? I can go and find the nearest highly rated clinic and then get a map to it versus somebody who doesn't have that kind of information. I can get information about a given symptom, about a given disease, about hospital wait times, about ratings for doctors. All sorts of things are going to be available to people who have the means to get to them. Unless there are some, I think, significant advances in terms of internet accessibility to the people who need it most. So those are the big three, mobile health and the digital divide that goes with it, participatory medicine, and then the quantified self and data tracking.
And speaking of participatory, there's a question I could open up to both of you with the next story, which comes from John's side of the table. The headline, Participatory Budgeting in Kenya. The finance minister invites suggestions to social media. Just to kind of wrap up what you were talking about, Alex, I mean, we see a lot of trends. We can read a lot of, we can get insights just from the kind of activity that we see, especially when we look at healthcare. Is there any concerted effort being processed at this point to really find out what people would want in terms of a participatory platform, or is it just really a function of reading trends?
Question for me there?
Yeah, it could be for both of you because, I mean, well, what I'm saying here is that in Kenya, for example, they are actually going out to their people to ask for input through social media. So I'm wondering in terms of healthcare, there's a lot of analysis being done, but is there anything being done in a concerted way to actually find out from people what they would want?
Yeah, I think that there certainly is. It depends upon which place you're talking about. I think this is something that actually, with respect to participatory budgeting versus a participatory consultation, which is what's happening in Kenya. In one case, government is giving people an option to give their feedback. In another case, they're actually giving people the power to make these decisions. And where the power rests is very important in these processes, right? That's been one of the things that people have pointed out with what the Obama administration did with their open government plan when they first came out in the consultation. Well, they said, We'll give us your ideas, and then we'll decide which to take. That there's still a power dynamic there, and the question in these spaces is to what extent a given mayor, governor, legislative body, whatever it happens to be, is willing to be held by the decisions of the crowd, and that's where the architectures of participation, what you refer to, are very important. And no one's really cracked this nut well yet. There's a lot of different startups that are trying to play around with it. You can look at the ideation platform, so to speak, these different software products, web applications, often sometimes internal things that are installed in networks that allow people to vote ideas up and down and try to bubble things up. You can see how Google Moderator has been used elsewhere on the web. And I think we'll see people continuing to try to crack that nut. What has become, I think, clear in the course of that is that structured participation around specific questions results in much better answers. And the question is going to be, who really builds a good platform for that? The federal government is trying to build something called ExpertNet that's still kind of out there. We'll see if they ever deliver on it or not. But certainly in the meantime, the private sector is going to move forward with that. Sometimes it may be mediated with a partner. It could be, a healthcare company gets together with a given media company. In some cases, it could be surveys. There's lots and lots of survey and polling companies out there. I think the challenge is going to be in each case some of the issues that we always have around identity, around gaming the system, around privacy, if it's asking people about their health, around security, if you're giving them the opportunity to put a lot of authenticating information about themselves into a given system, then you have to think through that. So it's very complex, but I do think that you're starting to see some traction, particularly where there's a real profit motive involved to know what people want.
Well, sometimes it takes us in, certainly even in this case in the story, John, with Kenya, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Uhuru Kenyatta, who's the Minister for Finance and the Deputy Prime Minister. He's very popular in social media, and he's obviously using it to reach out for suggestions. How is that process going? Do you think that's going to be a successful process for him?
I do think it's going to be a successful process. You know, some things to keep in mind that that Alex touched upon, and I think that they're important too. To some degree, there's a difference in terms of terminology between budgeting and all of this stuff in terms of the level of responsibility and control, who's in charge. In Kenya, important point, and I think this is actually still a good thing, the finance minister and his team is responsible for taking those ideas and deciding which ones to move forward on. In Kenya also, it's important to understand, though, social media, internet penetration, social media penetration, all of those things are much lower than they are in the United States as well. Mobile phone access is actually lower as well. You know, in the U.S., to Alex's point, 78% of people have internet access. I think 96% of people have a mobile phone, and 70 or 60% have smartphones, according to the latest numbers. In the U.S.
Yep.
Now, in Canada, Kenya's done a great job in terms of infrastructure, building out infrastructure and bandwidth, but they're still way behind in terms of the numbers we have in the United States. So one of the things to keep in mind when you start talking about participation, even in Kenya in this example, is what is the audience that's actually participating? Who's actually able to participate? And you need to keep that in mind in terms of the types of ideas you're going to get, in terms of who you're going to be able to reach and what the ideas are that they are going to be able to deliver. And that's why I think it's really important what's happening in Kenya, that it's not a citizens have control of saying, here are the ideas you need to move forward on, because the reality is it's not a high percentage of the citizenry that's able to participate. Now, Uhuru has, I think he has like 4,000 or 5,000 Twitter followers, which is impressive. And you know what, for the Kenyan audience, it's actually a pretty high percentage. And he has, 70,000 people that have liked his Facebook page. And he's getting a lot of input from those sources, as well as through the Google Doc that they all feed into. And I think it will be successful for a couple of reasons. It's successful in telling the people of Kenya that their government is at least attempting to listen to them. Now, there's always the question about what items they'll move forward on, but it's at least starting to build this change of perception in the fact that the people are viewing the government as listening to them. It's a start, and again, it's the percentage of the audience that's actually techno-savvy and is able to reach out on these platforms. But I think it's a good start, and I do think it's a start that is a successful start and that he will build upon. I had a brief chat with him on Twitter, very brief, and just enough to know that he's very optimistic and he sees this as something he wants to build upon.
Excellent. We've got time for one more story each. I want to stay with you, John, because I'd like to end off, Alexander, on the White House turns to Twitter story. So, John, you gave me a couple of stories. So I'm going to let you choose the UK or Bologna, whichever you think might be the one you'd like to finish with on today's show.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the case in Bologna, because I think it reflects as well what you see a lot here in the U.S. and in other places. Mm-hmm. What ended up happening was this gentleman who contributes on Government in the Lab, Alberto Carica, who's doing a lot of great work in Italy, was invited by Bologna, by the administration of Bologna, to come talk about how they could leverage open data and social media and other open government principles within the city to make it more transparent, to make it more efficient. And what was impressive was he had an audience of roughly 100 people in the room. So he had roughly 100 administrators for the city of Bologna coming in and listening to him talk about what they could do. The biggest pushback was not upon, why should we do this? The biggest pushback were all around the things around security. How do we make sure that the information is anonymous, so that way we're not actually getting into security problems. But there was no pushback in terms of the importance of doing this kind of effort and the importance of trying to move forward and become more transparent as a government. And what we're seeing throughout a lot of the places, what we're seeing throughout Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere, is really this understanding that you need to put this information out there. We have different levels, different reasons for it, and different ways in which it's happening. But what's exciting there is a real awareness and a real interest in sharing information with citizens.
Sounds kind of like what Walter is now doing in Kananaskis.
It's really the same thing.
Yeah, the evangelists are out there, and I mean, ultimately, the role of evangelists right now becomes even more significant. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Walter in what he's doing in the process. He's becoming more and more involved. We got time for one more. White House turns to Twitter to discuss President Obama's Middle East speech. The role of mobile phones, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter in the revolutions that have swept the Middle East has been the subject of much debate for months. What's the importance of this story, Alexander?
Well, I think in this case, we're looking at a couple of different things. The story itself is that the President of the United States stepped up and delivered a major policy address about the country's plans to reform the Middle East, or more to the point, support the reforms the citizens there are asking for themselves. And there are immense complexities to that. I am not a foreign policy expert per se, so I won't comment too much there. But I will say that the use of technology to communicate the speech itself and to host a global conversation was notable, and that's why I wrote about it. In this case, the White House is continuing to see real dividends from setting up a platform for broadcasting at whitehouse.gov/live. They've been able to convene conversations using different social networks, and today they pulled in really the preeminent curator of global conversations on Twitter, specifically about the Arab Spring, to help them facilitate a conversation, and that'd be NPR's Andy Carvin, Carvin. And what they did, they announced this conversation to be taking place. They pulled Andy in along with Mark Lynch, who's Abu Advark on Twitter, and let them collect the questions, let them solicit people to come and talk, and facilitated this discussion, and then questioned Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes at the State Department live on the White House live stream after the president concluded, and interacted in real time with the online community as the discussion went forward. And as you look at this, there's some hint of one possible future for how we can expect feedback and consultation and participation to really be enabled by this matrix of mobile technology, social media, and journalists who are willing to go out and engage this fully with the global publics. And today we saw it for a solid hour after the president's speech. For me, at least, that was even more interesting than the speech itself, particularly once I got my hands on a copy of it and could read it over. I participated in sharing the words as they came out and watching the reaction, but really seeing the ability of a global conversation to be brought home and then have the toughest questions served up from it by trusted mediators, journalists and an analyst, to somebody in power is a really important dynamic. And I don't think we'd see that, even a couple of years ago. I don't think the infrastructure was there for it. The policy was there for it. I think from my sense of where the reactions were that it was judged a success. I think everyone's trying to decide how that works. I know that there was a great deal of concern on the part of the journalists in question that they be completely independent and have discretion over the questions that they were asked. And as far as I can tell, that's what happened. I think it's a great thing that really shows that these technologies are moving into the mainstream. And we saw a story in Time come up this morning that says David Plouffe in the White House is actually reading and watching the reactions in real time to get data upon what people are keen off of. And we'll see more of that.
I think what I take away from this show is a couple of things. Number one, that the big divide is important. I mean, ultimately, there are people who are still without. So as technology continues to advance, it really becomes a function of who has technology in order to take advantage of what is happening in terms of the Gov2 world. The second thing I take away is, and I guess the question that will be answered only with time is, with all of this interaction, what kind of influence or what kind of impact will the influence of public opinion have on policies, whether they're foreign policy or domestic policies? And I guess we'll have an opportunity to talk a lot more about those kinds of things as time goes on. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for joining me. John Moore, founder and CEO, Government in the Lab. Alexander Howard, Washington Correspondent, O'Reilly Media. Thank you for joining us on Gov2. My name is Michael Kryton, in for Walter Schwabe. You're watching Fuse Logic TV. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.